Oh, good. I think that's a good amount. Okay. Thank you. Yes. Okay. Begin. Good evening, and welcome to the Explorers Club. My name is Lawrence Bergreen. I'm a longtime fellow of the club, and I've given some talks here in the past. It's my pleasure to introduce Darrell Freeman to you tonight and his new book, Ink and Ice and Black Battle of Ink and Ice. It's a book that I've had the pleasure of reading slowly and carefully. I think one of the best books on the subject that's going to be coming out in a long time. Darrell worked long and hard on it, and I appreciated it, having written several books about exploration, discovery over the years about Magellan and Marco Polo and Drake and some others. I realized how much effort and sheer brain work went into this, and I think the result is a very rewarding and resonant story. As you'll see, it's really two stories that are carefully folded around each other. One is the competition between two polar explorers to reach the North Pole. And then, as a very surprising follow-up, it's about the rivalry between two very different newspaper dynasties. The Herald, which was the big paper of the moment in New York at that time, which was also a rather in some ways a scandal-ridden sheet, and there's a bit about James Gordon Bennett Jr., who became the publisher, who was eccentric with a capital E and who was a libertine with a capital L, and then the up-and-coming, rather stuffy newspaper called the New York Times. They were to a certain extent trying to make their name and reputation with more sober, in both senses of the word, coverage of these explorers. So you see both the exploration and the social effect, the ripple effect of it, particularly New York-based, I think, which makes for a very rewarding book, and I think you'll enjoy it. Darrell, I've heard him speak before, is a very engaging speaker. And he will talk for a while, and then at the end there'll be some questions. So to begin with, I'd like to welcome Darrell to the podium. Are you there, Darrell? Oh, there he is. Okay. I'm going to take this. And,
do you want to sit in front?
Whatever's sit in the front, yeah. Not
Okay.
water, you could just...
Okay. Okay. Gotcha. Good evening. So thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate it. I've given a few of these talks, but I'm more thrilled, to be honest, to be doing one here at the Explorers Club. The atmosphere could not be more appropriate for this story. In fact, the club has a small role in this North Pole controversy between Frederick Cook and Robert Peary, both of whom served as presidents of the club. In fact, things got so heated at a certain point in this controversy that the people running the club instituted a new rule to go along with the dress code and various other regulations. And the rule was, it is forbidden to discuss Cook and Peary's controversy within club walls for the preservation of peace within the club. And the research actually for this began at the club for me, which we'll probably get into, we'll get into later. I want to thank Ann Passer for helping to make the event happen, and thanks to Larry Bergreen for that wonderful introduction. Let's get into it. So mostly I'm going to talk about these explorers and also the newspapers. Because we are here at the Explorers Club, the focus will be a bit more on the explorers and how they did their thing. September 1st, 1909 is where the story starts, the way I tell it, And on that date, this telegram was sent from Lerwick in the Shetland Islands. And it was from an American explorer who was respected but not that well known, and that was Frederick Cook. And in the telegram, he said he'd reached the North Pole on April 21st, 1908. This came completely out of the blue, really. It was known that Frederick Cook had quietly gone off into the Arctic in search of the North Pole. But like I said, he was not famous, and people had sort of forgotten about him. When he sent this telegram, he sent, I say telegram, it was in fact a cable, traveling beneath the sea along these cables from the Shetland Islands into the European continent. And he sold the story of his polar journey to the New York Herald. And the Herald gladly accepted this exclusive scoop because it truly was a huge story. This is what it looked like. I will say Frederick Cook had good reason to offer it to the Herald. He didn't have time on this return from Greenland to send a cable, wait for a response, start negotiating with different papers, play different offers off each other. He needed to do it quickly. And he chose the Herald because the Herald was the paper that had the strongest reputation for supporting, promoting, and writing about explorers and great feats of exploration. Just a sense of Cook's writing and what the story sounded like. This is Cook. What a cheerless spot about the North Pole, to have aroused the ambition of man for so many ages. No life, no land, no spot to relieve the monotony of frost. We were the only pulsating creatures in a dead world of ice. And the we there is Cook and his two Inuit companions, who he claimed to have gone to the North Pole with. And Cook proceeded to Copenhagen aboard a steamer. He did not have a way to get home on his own, so Denmark at that time controlled Greenland as a sort of colonial power, and it had steamer service. And Cook caught a ride back to Copenhagen aboard one of these steamers. And the great thing about this moment is there is video footage of it. And I'm hoping, how often do you get to see this stuff? So this was a huge story. I showed you the front page of the Herald. There he is. That's Frederick Cook. And, you know, the world's press had gathered in Copenhagen knowing he was arriving. All these preparations had been made to celebrate Frederick Cook, the discoverer of the North Pole. Tens of thousands of people gathering at the harbor in Copenhagen. That's the Crown Prince of Denmark, the tall gentleman. The royal family is turning out to celebrate him. The American minister is there. There he is trying to give a speech. He really couldn't be heard at the time. No one could hear nor really understand what he was saying, but it was just a lot of hat tipping. I mean, he was the most famous man in the world at this moment. And he was brought around Copenhagen every night, a different celebration, toasting Frederick Cook, the discoverer of the North Pole. And 3 nights in, he's at one of these dinners in Copenhagen. In the middle of the dinner, a messenger comes in, brings it to Cook, the guest of honor at that main table, and brings this telegram to Cook. Cook stands from the table and reads the telegram aloud. It says, "Stars and Stripes nailed to the pole, Robert Peary." So Robert Peary is another American polar explorer who's been seeking the North Pole, seeking it much more intensively than Cook has over the last few years. He is famous. He is expected to get there. His return is less of a surprise. And so for a couple days, there's actually more celebration because now 2 Americans have reached the pole. America's never been necessarily the leading power when it comes to exploring the Arctic, but it's been a big one. So this is a huge moment until 3 days later, Robert Peary does something that's never happened before in the history of exploring. He accuses Frederick Cook of lying. And so this is what leads to the North Pole controversy. So I said Cook has the Herald buying his story. The Herald is invested in Frederick Cook. The Herald will defend Frederick Cook throughout the fall as these 2 explorers argue over who is there first. Robert Peary has his own newspaper contract. It's with the New York Times. And this is Adolph Ochs, who's a major character in the book. I'm not going to talk about him much tonight, but Ochs had really rescued the Times from bankruptcy and irrelevance and brought it back to the forefront of the New York City newspaper scene. And at this point, it was really beginning to rival the Herald. These are the two powerful so-called quality newspapers at the time. And they were both interested in topics like foreign news and science and exploring. So this debate between Cook and Peary would also be a kind of proxy war between the Times and the Herald, and between Adolph Ox and James Gordon Bennett Jr., who ran the Herald. So Bennett, we don't really remember him much today. He was an incredibly colorful character, and in his own day was larger than life. I would say he makes Elon Musk seem boring by comparison. In terms of just the headlines he made, the stories that were told about him, the eccentricities, the unpredictability. Unlike Ox, he did not create a dynasty. He was the end of a dynasty that in fact only lasted 2 generations. Adolph Ox, his descendants, the Sulzbergers, still control the New York Times today, whereas the Herald really expired with the death of James Gordon Bennett Jr. So who was James Gordon Bennett Jr.? He was the man responsible, really, for this whole relationship the book talks about between newspapers and explorers. We'll get into just how he started that. He was the son of James Gordon Bennett Sr., who had founded the Herald in 1835, and James Gordon Bennett Sr., hugely influential character in the history of newspapers. The Herald he founded was really the first modern newspaper in many ways, and the primary thing about that was that it was independent. It was not beholden to a political party. It did not parrot party messages. It was not owned by a clique of investors. It was reporting independent news. And James Gordon Bennett Sr. was very enterprising in how he got the news. He sent ships out to intercept ocean liners. He used the telegraph aggressively. He's credited with doing the first interview in the history of journalism related to an axe murder in the 1830s. And he really had no problem making tons of enemies. He really railed against the sort of established elite of New York City. And he was the first newspaper owner to really build a business on the reader. That is to say, he would inform and entertain the readers at all costs, and that would be his ticket to success. So his legacy is very influential. It is mixed. Horace Greeley, who's probably the most famous newspaperman of this era, said of James Gordon Bennett Sr., he made the newspaper powerful, but he also made it odious. His editorial opinions, sometimes the less said about them, the better. He was pro-slavery until it became politically untenable for him as a Northerner to hold that position. He was really channeling this sort of common energy of the public, and he said he never wanted to be ahead of the public in anything in terms of the morality or the progressivism of it. So he had only one son, and that was our friend here, James Gordon Bennett Jr., looking very disaffected on the eve of his Union Army service. Brief and undistinguished service in the Civil War. His father donated a yacht to the Union Navy, and James Bennett Jr. came attached to the yacht. He lasted about a month until he was sent back. So he was raised in France, not by his father, but by his mother. They were essentially separated because Bennett Sr. was just a very difficult personality and was always, in fact, he was often getting beaten up in the streets because of his editorial opinions. So Bennett Jr. was raised as a sort of silver spoon child on the European continent, mostly in France. This would give him a cosmopolitan point of view. He spoke French, and he was always interested in what was going on in Europe, which would have consequences later on. He moved to New York City as a teenager and developed a sort of notorious reputation as a rambunctious bachelor and playboy. He could not hold a drink, and all kinds of shenanigans tended to ensue. He was spotted driving horse carriages around the city naked in the middle of the night. He got in fist fights. He caused all kinds of havoc, and usually he made it all go away by writing a check the next morning. That was his way. But he eventually became interested in the New York Herald and taking over the reins from his father. He's made the managing editor of the paper as his father was sort of semi-retired. And in 1871, as the sort of managing editor of the New York Herald, he makes a very important decision to send Henry Stanley to Africa to find Dr. David Livingstone, the most famous living explorer of this time. David Livingstone was a missionary. He was considered a progressive at the time. He was a humanitarian bent on improving and civilizing Africa in the way that people thought of it back then, and he had gone missing. And Henry Stanley was interested in finding him. James Gordon Bennett Jr. thought this would make a smashing news story if a Herald correspondent went into Africa and found Livingstone. And I think we know how the story ended, because the famous line, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, is from the moment when Stanley did find Livingstone in what is now Tanzania, and brought him relief supplies and food and everything he needed to continue exploring. And Stanley came back with the news story of the decade, which belonged exclusively to the New York Herald. This is what a bombshell story looked like in 1872. A lot of text to get through. Not all about the clicks. It's a long read with about 15 subheads on the left side there. And what was considered very advanced graphics at the time, a map. And the Herald was known for this. Maps, good maps, accurate maps, interesting stories, and all this sort of risky enterprise, which this epitomized. The different thing about this expedition, previously this would have been undertaken by a government or something like the Royal Geographical Society. An explorer has gone missing, we need to go find him. Of course, I say this, I have to say there are some resonances to what is going on now, the Titanic and the submersible, and we hope and pray that that will end well. And two club members are missing at the moment. At the time, it was considered wild that a newspaper would spend the money and put the effort into doing this. James Gordon Bennett had money to spend, and he thought it was worth the effort. So this is a huge story. It lifts the Herald even more head and shoulders above the other papers in New York City, and it creates a sort of mini trend in the 1870s for newspapers sending correspondents off on wild adventures. It's just a very fun period in the history of newspapers, and it gets James Gordon Bennett Jr. thinking about going to the North Pole. So I want to do it again, except I want to do it in the Arctic. So he teams up with an American Navy Lieutenant, James Washington DeLong. They buy a ship eventually after much searching. And here again, James Gordon Bennett is going to fund this attempt to get to the North Pole, which is a crazy James Gordon Bennett thing to do. And I'm going to use the clicker for a second. So Bennett, of course, confident everyone else has been going about this North Pole finding wrong. The Americans and the British especially keep going up the west coast of Greenland, the east coast of what is now Arctic Canada. It becomes called the American route, and they squeeze up, they go through Baffin Bay, Smith Sound, and they end up here. There's a very popular theory at the time called the theory of the open polar sea. It has to do with some scientific research that's going on with ocean currents. Also a lot of sort of wishful thinking involved. Basically, the thinking is that, yes, there's a big ring of ice here to push through. But once we break through the ice, we're studying these currents and these other things, we think it's going to actually be kind of warm, and the sea is going to be open in the middle of the polar region, and it's going to be smooth sailing. And so Bennett is convinced of this theory, even though his scientific training is really quite minimal. And he and DeLong contrived to send their ship, the Jeannette, up through Alaska and the Bering Strait in hopes of punching through some ice and getting to this open polar sea. There's actually a very popular article in Putnam's magazine around this time, theorized that the climate at the North Pole was akin to the climate of Buffalo, New York, and really quite temperate and reasonable. They were obviously wrong. This theory was poppycock. And tragically, the Jeannette gets not only trapped in ice, which was expected to be fair. It was expected these ships to get trapped in ice. The Jeannette was the most expensively, fully armored ship ever sent north. It got trapped in the ice, as I say, but then it also sank in the ice. And this created a massive survival tale, really. It did not get far at all. It went to 77 degrees north. It really did not get close to the pole. The officers and crew, after the ship went down, traveled some 600 miles across the ice and water to get to the Siberian coast. They're hauling something like 15,000 pounds of gear and supplies, and some of them are incapacitated. They eventually take 2 boats, as some of the things they're hauling are boats, and they get into open water, and they get separated in these boats They are on the coast of Siberia. They're wandering, starving, hungry, lost, completely lost in this labyrinth of braided rivers and muddy shoals on the Siberian coast. And these are the only survivors. So of the 33 men, these are the survivors. Word gets back. It's a huge news story of the period. The search for the survivors of the Jeannette kicks into gear. This whole story is told very well by Hampton Sides in a book called In the Kingdom of Ice. If you haven't read it, I do recommend it. So the fallout from this is significant because it is a huge tragedy, and it's considered a quite ill-advised expedition. And it fails for a couple reasons. It fails because this open sea theory is incorrect, but Bennett, in his attempt to twin a scientific expedition with something that's going to sell newspapers, actually causes problems as well. One thing Bennett tries to do, he tries to recreate this Stanley Livingstone moment, right, which has been the bombshell story. There's a Swedish polar explorer named Nordenskjöld who's not been heard from, which does not mean he is missing, but Bennett chooses to interpret this to mean he needs help. So he actually sends DeLong on this sort of goose chase that wastes precious sailing months searching for Nordenskjöld, who does not need to be found, and in fact is perfectly comfortable and comes out as the first explorer to do the Northeast Passage while DeLong is looking for him. So that hampers the expedition of the Jeannette. The other thing that hampers this expedition is the correspondent Bennett has put on board to write the stories, who knows nothing about the way the Navy works and does not fit very comfortably into the naval hierarchy and creates some discipline problems on board. So I'm not saying these things caused the Jeannette. There was some bad luck involved, and I think that polar sea argument is the big culprit. But it does really highlight the challenge and these sort of conflicting motivations here with these privately funded expeditions and someone as sort of reckless as James Gordon Bennett. Also at this time, there's a disastrous army expedition in the North Pole led by Adolphus Greely. There's a painting out there of this. Also ended in grief. And basically, the U.S. government, as a result of these failed Army and Navy expeditions, decided is going to get out of polar exploring. Yes, Bennett paid for the Jeannette fiasco, but the Navy took a lot of, was very embarrassed and damaged by it. So a new era of polar exploring sort of begins, an era in which the explorers themselves must be more entrepreneurial. They must raise the money privately, and they must use the newspapers to their advantage to build publicity for their expeditions. And Henry Stanley has been doing this. He's a very enterprising herald explorer. He convinced these papers to send to Africa multiple times. But one other interesting person I learned about researching this book who's been overlooked is Frederick Schwatka, who here's shown in his stylish furs. This is not in the field, as you can tell. It's a studio shot. And this becomes relevant later on. He's got his navigational instruments there on the left. I'll talk about Peary in a second. So why is Schwatka important? A couple things. He changes the techniques of Arctic travel. He goes to the Canadian Arctic, he goes to Alaska, he goes to the Yukon, and when he's in the farthest north areas, he's a very practical man, and he has the good sense to do it the way the natives do it. He's able to drop some of the racism of the period and realize that the Inuit who've been living here for generations actually know how to survive better than we do. So he wears fur, like you see in the picture. He adopts the native diet, hunting for game meat and eating a lot more fresh meat, which has the benefit, you don't have to bring as much rations with you, and it has the benefit of forestalling things like scurvy. It's actually just a healthier way to survive in the Arctic. And importantly, he also lets the Inuit handle the sled dogs. He recognizes that sled dogs are the way to go, and that the white men just cannot drive them the way that the natives can drive them. And so this is a great thing that Robert Peary, for one, will adapt, this sort of method. And the other thing Schwatka is good at is convincing newspapers to send him to go to these places. He does a big story for the New York Times about an expedition in Alaska, very good at selling himself to the press. So Robert Peary will pick up on these techniques of survival, techniques of self-promotion, and he's more ambitious than Schwatka, I would say. Schwatka never really set his sights on the North Pole. He wanted achievable things. His ambitions were a little more realistic. Peary was just a man of an iron will who would not let things or people get in his way, for better and for worse. This is a young Robert Peary. He grew up in Maine, my home state, and graduated of Bowdoin College, joined the Navy as an engineer, and made his first Arctic expedition in 1886, traveling over the Greenland ice sheet. And this really lights a fire under him, and you tell from his letters of this period, he's not particularly beguiled by the Arctic or in love with the Arctic. He really wants fame and glory, and he's chosen the Arctic as the field, the terrain in which to achieve that. Just a very Peary attitude. The more important expedition is a little later. The first one, he brings a group of people. This is 1891. He goes back to Greenland, and he's got some of the team here that will become important to his story later on. The team includes his wife, which is remarkably uncommon for the time. But Josephine Peary, in many ways, was as hungry and ambitious a person as Robert Peary was. And the bundle she's holding there, another very Peary family move, draped in the American flag, was their baby. They had a child in the Arctic, the first white child born in the Arctic, Marie Peary, who became a popular sensation known as the Snow Baby. And as a result of this, here's Robert Peary being manly with his sled dogs trying to break new ground, and they come back to the U.S., and the newspapers are far more interested in the Snow Baby and Josephine's writings about domestic life in the Arctic than they are in Peary's tales of manly survival. But they do make a very smart professional couple, these two. Another important character Peary brings along, this is the Explorers Club. It's almost the house of Matthew Henson in some ways. If you remember here, you've certainly heard about him. But another just incredible fact of the time, Robert Peary had taken on Henson as his assistant in 1887, and by 1891, Matthew Henson had begun traveling to the Arctic with Robert Peary and becoming a very important, really an invaluable member of every expedition that Peary did. Henson would learn the Inuit language, Inuktitut, in a way that Peary never did learn it, and he became an excellent driver of sled dogs, probably the best non-Inuit driver of sled dogs at this period. So what is going on in the 1890s with Peary? He does this Greenland expedition. He finds evidence that Greenland is an island, which isn't fully understood yet at this point. That's considered significant. This point where Greenland ends, and Greenland does not go all the way to the North Pole. You have to step onto this frozen Arctic Ocean if you want to achieve the North Pole, which is bad news for explorers because it's much harder to travel over. I will admit, I started researching this book not fully understanding what the Arctic Sea was like. I thought, well, it looks hard, but it's probably pretty, maybe it's broken at some points and there's these leads which are sort of channels or rivers of water, but it's pretty flat, right? It is not flat and has these enormous pressure ridges. And so it's really, they're hauling these heavy sleds up and over pressure ridges. Before and after they run into these giant leads. One of the leads, Peary estimated, was as wide as the Hudson River. So you've either got to have a kayak to get across that water, or in Peary's case, you wait days, sometimes weeks, for that thing to freeze over. So just a sense of how difficult it is to get anywhere on this frozen Arctic Ocean. Peary at the time, in the 1890s, is not getting very far, to be honest, and he's in the Navy. He does not always successfully get the extended leaves that he needs to do these North Pole attempts. So he switches gears in a way, and he starts collecting things that will build his reputation, that will get him powerful allies. And the biggest thing he collects while he's up in this northern Greenland area around Cape York is this meteorite. And in collecting this meteorite, Peary solves a really fascinating mystery of the time, and that is, how do these Inuit have metal? Because there's not much to use up in this northern Greenland area in terms of natural materials. They come into driftwood sometimes, but there's obviously no trees to cut down. But for decades, if not centuries, explorers have been puzzled by the fact that they have metal. And even before the arrival of people like Peary bringing metal, they had metal in their harpoon tips, for example, and other little bits of metal. And they never gave up the secret of where it came from. Peary, either bribed or coerced or convinced some weak link in this tribe of the Cape York Inuits to bring him to the source of metal. It turned out to be a meteorite. A 4.5 billion year old meteorite was their source of iron. And Peary, being Peary, took it. And Peary, being an engineer, managed to find a way to move this 30-ton piece of meteorite onto rails and onto the ship that he took back to New York City. And this was newsworthy. This made his reputation. Here's Peary figuring out stuff, and it really solidified his relationship with some very powerful New York City businessmen and philanthropists who were interested in science and interested in polar exploration. This gentleman on the left with the fabulous mustache is one of his chief backer and the first president of what would come to be called the Peary Arctic Club. That's Morris Jessup, who was a banker and philanthropist. He was a founder of the YMCA of New York City and keenly interested in science and exploration. He was also the first president of the American Museum of Natural History, which is founded around this time. As well as, he's not involved in the National Geographic Society, but the National Geographic Society is another sort of philanthropic exploration body that is founded around this time and with which Robert Peary is going to develop some very close ties, which are going to be very helpful to him later on in the North Pole controversy. These are the ties that Frederick Cook does not have when it comes to duking out this public battle over who got to the North Pole and who did not, who has the reputation to have gotten to the North Pole and who does not. These powerful New York City friends help Robert Peary to become at least admired by Theodore Roosevelt, shown there on the right. Peary named his ship the Roosevelt after Theodore Roosevelt, who really championed him as the powerful and inspiring symbol of American strength and manliness, really. Despite all this, in the 1890s and early 1900s, Peary is not the most successful explorer out there. He's very much in the shadow. He's accomplishing less than certain European explorers, and he's very much in the shadow of this guy, who looks like, and in fact was a rock star, Fridtjof Nansen. You can just tell he's a serious dude. And for my money, this book is not about Nansen. Of course, he needs his moment in the spotlight. He really is the complete package, and you learn about different types of explorers during this period, their strengths and weaknesses. I can't find a weakness of Nansen's. He was courageous. He was creative. He was charismatic. He had an incredible will to succeed and get there, but he's also a genuine man of science, and he studied things like ocean currents and oceanography in a way that Peary, for example, just never really got interested in. He's a Norwegian national hero for good reason. And in 1896, he achieves the new farthest north, which had been set 12 years previously by that Greeley expedition I mentioned. The U.S. Army expedition did get closer to the pole than anyone before, despite the fact that more than half of them died. Nansen got farther and no one died. He was just very good at keeping people alive and doing things with less effort. And to top it all off, Nansen, on his return from this farthest north journey, ends up in Franz Josef Land, which is northeast of Svalbard, and achieves the Stanley Livingstone moment that James Gordon Bennett was willing to kill for, because he is found by a British expedition that is doing scientific research. Nansen's been missing for years. On his return journey from this farthest north, people are assuming he's dead, and he skis across the snowy terrain here, makes some noise, and is discovered by Frederick Jackson of this British expedition. I said this is the moment Bennett was killing for the Herald. In fact, Jackson's British expedition had been organized by the Royal Geographic Society and a London press baron named Alfred Harmsworth, who had just several months earlier founded a newspaper called the Daily Mail. So Nansen's journey, but specifically this incredible moment where he's alive and they shake hands in the wilderness, which just has this weird power as a story, goes to the Daily Mail. So let's get back to newspapers just for a second. What is going on in the New York City newspaper world? Two very influential people have, I would say, exploded the newspaper norms. This is Joseph Pulitzer on the left. This is William Randolph Hearst on the right. They have introduced a whole new way of doing newspapers. They are cheaper. They are splashier. They have more pictures. They put murder and sex on the front pages. They really are the granddaddies of today's tabloid newspapers. And when you study media history, this is often accorded all kinds of space, and it is a super fascinating, interesting period of American journalism history. What often gets overlooked is what's going on at the other papers, which happen to be the ones that are sort of central to this story. The Herald, the James Gordon Bennett, what was going on with the Herald? In fact, the Herald, for all the talk about Pulitzer and Hearst, the Herald was the most profitable newspaper in America still. Part of the reason is it cost 3 cents, not 1 cent. But part of the reason is just a lot of people still read the Herald. And I just try to explain, I try to figure out why, and the Herald is very fun to read when you're going to these archives. The New York Times you sort of recognize as the New York Times. It was more pro-Wall Street back then. It was a more conservative in some ways than it is now. But it has that vibe. And there's nothing left really that is like the Herald. I think of the Herald as kind of a combination of the New York Times, the New York Post, and Vanity Fair, all rolled into one. They love royals. They love yacht races. They cover hunting and shooting and society. And the main reason for that is it is run by James Gordon Bennett, who wants a newspaper that he himself is interested in reading. So it has these other topics. It's really up to him to decide what goes in there. So that's happening with the Herald. Because it is continuing to make James Gordon Bennett rich, it has this beautiful building and actually sort of helps move New York City's center of gravity uptown. All the newspapers at this time were down on Park Row by the Brooklyn Bridge, very far downtown. The Herald starts this trend of moving uptown. Anyone know where the Herald moved to? Herald Square. Who's buried in Grant's tomb? So the Herald is in Herald Square. It's this gorgeous Italian-style building. This is the headquarters. And I'll mention here, James Gordon Bennett is never here. James Gordon Bennett lives 3,000 miles away in Paris. And he is either in his house in the Champs-Élysées or his house on the Côte d'Azur on the Riviera, or he is on his yacht, the Lysistrata, which is the fastest, most opulent pleasure vessel of the period. Has incredible amenities, including its own dairy cow, so that Bennett and his guests can always drink fresh milk. The cow's name is Bossy. So you're asking, why is Bennett in Paris? He's running this newspaper using the cables, which is insane and expensive and ineffective. He wakes up at 6 in the morning and sends a bunch of commands by cable to his editors in New York at midnight to make some last-minute changes before the paper comes out, based on the European papers he's reading at 6 in the morning, right? This is the nightmare boss. He can afford the cables, though, and he's in Paris kind of out of necessity because many years before, he has utterly disgraced himself in a way that there is no coming back from. And you're going to have to read the book to see what he did. There were many Victorian ladies in the room at the time, and some of them are said to have fainted. So he's living in Paris. He's running the paper from this crazy place. I'm losing my notes. Hold on. I can probably improvise it. And he is somewhat interested in exploration, but not completely interested in it. He's let sporting events take over for exploring. Bennett has this adventurous spirit. He's given up the four-in-hand coaching because he smashed his head on his own house arch one night, so he doesn't do that fast coaching anymore. He's still in the yacht, and he's occasionally funding expeditions. This is a shot of a balloon journey by the Swedish explorer Salomon André in 1897. Bennett actually did offer André $25,000 to take along a Herald reporter because he wanted the exclusive on this balloon journey. André said no and unwittingly saved the life of a Herald journalist because that balloon, it was a crash landing that happened. They didn't die immediately, but it was a miserable sort of slow death on the ice of starvation, as so often happened during this time. That's why the public was so interested, and that's why the stories were so big. People were truly risking a lot to try to get to the North Pole, whether it was by dog sled, as Peary was doing, or by balloon and airship, as other people were doing. And I have to say the balloon efforts never ended well, ever. They never got nearly as far as they said they would. So, Bennett is somewhat interested in exploration, as I said. He is involved in some of Peary's expeditions in a small way. He's negotiating tough deals with Peary. And he is not really funding Peary to the extent that he used to fund people. Peary goes on a 4-year expedition, 1898 to 1902. It's really that long because after year 1 and 2, he hasn't achieved anything. And Peary, being Peary, just refuses to go home. And the Peary Arctic Club sends a relief mission up to see how he's doing and also persuade him to come home. Josephine Peary is desperate for him to come home and be with his family. The Peary Arctic Club brings a volunteer doctor up to examine Peary because Peary has fallen out with the doctor who went with him, won't speak to the man. The doctor who comes along to examine Peary is Frederick Cook. So Frederick Cook, who went with Peary, I forget if I mentioned this, on that Greenland expedition where Josephine Peary was along and Matthew Henson was along, Frederick Cook was also an expedition member, so they have this history. But they're not really friends anymore because they've kind of become rivals. And Frederick Cook examines Peary, finds him in horrible shape, starved, has the sort of signs of an anemic situation going on from his lack of fresh meat, is Cook's diagnosis. And Peary has lost 8 of his 10 toes. So this is the period when Peary makes an insane decision to travel far, far north in December, which is the worst time of year to do this. He just will not be talked out of it. And there's this moment where Matthew Henson is with Peary in this abandoned old cabin of the Greeley expedition. And they've come in and they're trying to warm up and rest after this wearying, and it's dark, right? There's no sunlight. This is a night journey, the whole thing, because the sun doesn't even come up this time of year. They're in this cabin. Peary, Henson, the sort of assistant / manservant, has Peary sitting down and is pulling off his boots because Peary is complaining of a wooden feeling in his legs. And Henson peels this rabbit fur sock off of Peary to see what's going on with his feet and shins, and 8 of the toes just come off with this rabbit's fur sock. So and Peary said, as it's recorded, Peary essentially says, well, that's what you've got to do if you want the pole. And just an insanely driven man who just went to these crazy lengths and was hyper competitive. He had thought he needed to do this because a Norwegian expedition was racing him to the pole. In truth, this Norwegian expedition was not even going for the pole. They were doing the much more practical and useful business of mapping parts of Arctic Canada. And so this is one reason expeditions like that would come back having really achieved something significant. And Peary came back from this expedition with 2 toes left. But he gets on his game because he gets the Roosevelt, that icebreaker vessel that I mentioned. And in 1906, Peary achieves the farthest north. So he's sort of back in the headlines as the American who's made it closest to the pole, the person on the planet who's made it closest to the pole. And the Herald runs that story. It's a pretty big story. The Roosevelt, the reason that is useful is it allows him to just bust through the ice. This is really the first modern icebreaker, certainly the first purpose-built Arctic vessel in the Western Hemisphere. And it gives Peary a huge advantage. It also costs $100,000, which is what his donors provide. He can push up to basically the tip of Ellesmere Island and then get onto this frozen landscape with his dog sleds rather than exhausting the men and the dogs and using up food supplies earlier. When Peary tries to make his last attempt on the pole in 1908, the Herald is the natural fit. He wants to get Herald money in exchange for the newspaper rights. The Herald, by this point, James Gordon Bennett, has turned into an even more of a managerial nightmare, which I get into in the book, and it's sort of in a shambles. And the Herald, the editor at the New York Herald that Peary meets with, has no existing, all these people quit the Herald, so Peary's old friends at the Herald are no longer there. They're actually at the Times. The Herald's man in New York tells Peary they're not interested in funding his expedition. Sorry, we'll pick up the story from the newswires. Good luck. So Peary limps, because he's got his 2 toes, he limps up Broadway to the new headquarters of the New York Times, which is a very successful paper at this point. That's we'll get to him. That's Ox on the left. Ox has hired this essentially genius of the newsroom, Carr Van Anda, who I wrote about him for The Atlantic a couple weeks ago. He is a man who is a teenage math prodigy. He read Egyptian hieroglyphics. He knew maps incredibly well. He understood physics. He later, huge piece of Times newsroom lore, actually corrected an error of one of Einstein's equations. This is the man running the New York Times newsroom in 1908 when Robert Peary comes in, and he's very interested in scientific topics. In fact, the whole New York Times has not only become profitable and popular and has been gaining readership every year, it is truly poaching Herald people like William Reich here, a Herald executive who has sort of more of a bare-knuckle style of newspapering than the genteel Times guys like Van Anda, and that will be hugely important during this North Pole controversy. But the Times has really stepped on the toes of the Herald in an obvious way by getting interested in foreign news. It's beefing up its foreign news department, which has always been a specialty of the Herald. It's gotten interested in science and technology. There's a ton of aviation news at this time, which is a Herald specialty, but now the Times is really into aviation as well. And the Times is also working with wireless, which is this new technology that allows you to get information from sea, right? So those undersea cables are land-to-land communication, but with wireless, which is sort of the original radio, ships can now send their news to a shore station before they even get to shore. So there's a huge competitive advantage if you're using wireless, and the Times is using wireless before the Herald. So at this moment, and this is where I'm wrapping up, at this moment, the Times is actually really into Robert Peary. Another reason the Times is very much an establishment paper. It is the sort of East Coast establishment's paper. The Herald has this sort of populist streak. It has scandal. Some of the more educated, refined readers think the Herald's kind of a gutter paper. So the fact that Peary's a Navy man, he's the sort of scientific establishment's choice, he's a wonderful fit for the Times, and they cut a deal. The Times puts $4,000 into Peary's expedition. Not that much, frankly, given how expensive these were. And it's a loan. Peary will repay it from the syndication rights. Syndication rights will repay the loan, and if they fall short, Peary has to pay it out of his own pocket. This is an unheard of arrangement, very favorable, it would seem, to the Times. But in 1909, when Frederick Cook comes back, this is him after his polar journey in Greenland, not looking his best. You remember when he came back to Copenhagen, he was pretty spruced up and whatnot. This is what an Arctic explorer looks like when he's still in the Arctic. When Frederick Cook comes back and says he got to the North Pole a year before Robert Peary did, Robert Peary is going to be very happy. He has the New York Times on his side, invested in his journey, and very devoted to sniffing out the weird things about Cook's story that deserve further scrutiny. Cook, on the other hand, has James Gordon Bennett, who, as we know, is fairly erratic. And his paper, while influential, is not as scientifically astute. It does not have the same kind of bloodhound mentality, at least in this subject area, as the Times has. But essentially, this is the set of alliances that are going to go head-to-head through the fall of 1909. And basically, what this controversy does, and it's just, the reason I was drawn to this book is there really is no other moment like this that I can find in the history of exploring, where something that was considered so honorable, populated by trustworthy men who were stoic and told the truth and didn't do ungentlemanly things, that whole paragon, that whole ideal fell in a pile of shambles. fell apart. And it took a long time. It maybe never came back. It's been called the first sort of like modern or postmodern moment of exploring, because all of a sudden we don't really know what happened and what didn't. We can't trust these people anymore. And importantly, the evidence they brought back was not compelling. It was very inconclusive, frankly. And just a quick side note, it's not all their fault. It's the fault of the North Pole, because unlike the South Pole, which is a fixed point on land, the Antarctic continent, the South Pole would be discovered 2 years later by Roald Amundsen without controversy. There's no question of whether he got there or he didn't. Robert Scott got there 5 weeks later to find Amundsen had left some stuff there. So very clear that it was discovered. No one argued about that. The North Pole, completely different situation. It's on drifting sea ice. As you're proceeding towards the North Pole, the currents are pushing you off course, usually to the west. You have to take constant compass bearings and sextant readings and other navigational checks. A lot of those checks can only happen if the weather is clear, which it rarely is. It's basically, one French paper called it a metaphysical question. Very postmodern in some ways to me. So they were battling against these odds, the true navigational, diabolical difficulty, really, of navigating to 90 degrees north, given the technology of the time. However, they also did a poor job of making their case in hindsight. These photos prove absolutely nothing. This is a photo Cook claims to have taken at the North Pole with his Inuit companions there on the left. You know, the sense that you just stick an American flag in the ice and call it good. Prevails as you were reading back into these stories. Here's Peary's shot photos, because they both did bring cameras with them. On the left, his 4 Inuit companions and Matthew Henson, I believe, is in the middle, and then a shot of them after the big polar moment. But there's nothing in these photos to prove that the pole was actually reached, whether it was missed and Peary knew he'd missed it, or Peary thought he was there but actually had not reached the pole. Either way, you read the evidence and the proofs that were presented, and it is very hard to come to a conclusive idea about what happened. I have an opinion. Other people have opinions, but it is not cut and dry. So the other thing they failed to do, and I'll end here, they did not bring back witnesses who were considered credible. Now, these are Cook's companions, Itukishuk and Awela. Peary and Matthew Henson, honestly, who knew the Inuit more than Peary did and more intimately, always dismissed these guys as mere boys who had never been on the frozen Arctic ice and didn't really know. Compared to the sort of veteran polar parties, they did not really know what they were doing. Their testimony they were considered not credible for racist reasons on the one hand, but they also, it is true that you really needed to know how to use a sextant in order to determine if you had been to the North Pole. You needed this training in scientific instruments, and these guys did not have that training. Neither did Matthew Henson. Robert Peary made a very peculiar decision, because this man, Bob Bartlett, the captain of the Roosevelt, who went on to the polar ice with Peary, did have that training, a very skilled navigator. Peary sent him back when he was 130 miles away from the pole. So Bob Bartlett did not go on that final dash to the pole. Instead, Peary had only very skilled winter travelers who absolutely knew how to survive and travel on the ice, but did not know how to use these scientific instruments that would prove you had been where you said you had been. And this lack of evidence was really at the heart of this controversy, and it is what fueled an ongoing sort of reality show of the newspapers, because as long as you couldn't prove something definitively one way or the other, the argument could continue and continue and continue, and more dramatic things could happen. And that is why it really turned into the story of the year, if not the decade. And honestly, that is why I consider it the most fascinating debate I've ever learned about in the history of exploring, why I decided to write a book about it. So with that, I'll thank you for listening. Alex, could we put the screen up? Larry, do you want to join me over here? I think Ann does it here. I think it's okay. Is there a third mic for running around? Yes. Okay. Do we have a runner? Should I get my wife? I will. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, on behalf of everybody, I want to say that was a really wonderful, enjoyable talk. And,
Thank you.
It was enlightening. It was startling.
Lights.
It was shocking. It was scandalous. some other journalistic headlines.
What? Oh, we do? For the live stream?
What?
Okay. All right.
What?
Pause. Pause.
Okay.
And the screen will go up right now.
Okay. All right.
You want to sit there?
Okay. Let's see if I can.
Oh, can you get on that?
We'll see. It's probably easier if I stand.
Okay.
I was wondering, though, as I was listening to your account, because there was so much chicanery.
Yes, much chicanery.
Yes. When did things become more scientific, more objective, and more accurate?
When did thing become?
your opinion.
You mean in this controversy itself? When did the science kick in, or?
Yes, when did science kick in this kind of exploration?
Well, in this controversy, there was a truly definitive moment involving the University of Copenhagen.
Uh-huh.
So when Frederick Cook came back to Copenhagen in September 1909, he effectively told the Danes,
Yes.
you get to review my proofs first, and then took almost 4 months to give them the proofs, which is one reason this thing lasted so long.
Yes.
Frederick Cook made many lucrative lectures while not giving those proofs to the Danes.
Yes.
So there was a moment in which the Danes examined the proofs that Cook had provided and made a very definitive statement that they did not prove he'd made it to the pole. So that was a definitive scientific statement that Cook had failed to prove it.
Right. Right.
So that would be my answer for this controversy. I don't have, that's a tough question to answer. I don't know as much about the later things, but I do think as into the 20s and 30s, you have very dodgy reports of people having claimed to fly over the North Pole and back. But these dubious claims definitely continued into the 20s. However, I will say Roald Amundsen, who discovered the South Pole, as I say, without dispute, also flew an airship over the North Pole in 1926 without dispute. And the reason there was no dispute was he had something like 14 people with him, and he was transmitting using wireless in real time. They had all the instruments. They had this giant airship with plenty of people and instruments aboard to confirm he had been there.
Fascinating. There must be some questions from the audience for our speaker tonight, for Darrell.
If not, you can throw me another one. And if you've got a question, wait for the mic. Yes, because we do have a live stream, and they can't hear you otherwise.
What do they eat and drink during these expeditions?
That's a good question. What do they eat and drink during the expeditions? Well, the time-honored Arctic food is pemmican, which is a sort of fatty, meaty concoction that no one really likes the taste of, but it's very compact and it has a lot of protein. But as I say, there was this shift around the time of the 1880s, I would say, when more explorers really identified, as long as you're in these game lands, before you get too far north, if you can hunt things like muskoxen and eat that meat, it's tastier and it's better. Now, I went to Greenland while I was revising this book, and it was not a risky expedition. It was a luxury cruise for a travel magazine. But I did taste raw seal blubber, just to try to, that, which is also something these explorers ate when they had to, and it is not good, in my opinion. If you're raised on it, apparently it's enjoyed there, which is great, and no judgments, but it does not go down easily. So seal blubber, muskox. I had muskoxen stew. That was almost like a gamey beef stew. That was like venison, it's pretty tasty, to be honest. But seal blubber, they did eat walrus sometimes. And then for that last dash, you were usually eating pemmican, just because your weight was such a concern. You were really It's like these ultralight hikers nowadays. You're really, each ounce matters on these heavy sleds. So pemmican was still being used because it was lighter than the game meat. But that was the combination. They were adapting to a large extent the Inuit diet, which is super meat intensive. It's really just meat.
Anybody else?
Yes. Who do you think personally made it first, or do you think neither of them actually did?
Amundsen in the airship would be my answer. 1926. Well, it's also just like there's a burden of proof on the explorer who's doing this thing, and Cook certainly, and Peary also failed to meet that standard, I would say. Amundsen met that standard and therefore I think deserves the credit, even though he flew there. It's a shame because it was thought that someone had gotten there using dog sled, efforts to get there on land stopped for many, many decades. Until 1968, an insurance salesman from Minnesota named Ralph Plaisted got there using a snowmobile. But no one had really tried that dog sled journey because they moved on. They moved on to other forms that were more innovative, or they wanted to get a first. Today, a lot of these types of ventures are about getting a first. So if someone's already gotten there on dog sled, getting there on dog sled again is not a first, and no one's going to try to do it. So they move to the air and then other methods.
Thanks for a great presentation. Reading about the race for the South Pole, Amundsen is presented as really innovative in using the dogs, the skis, the furs, and taking advantage of native people's northern cold experiences. So
yes.
So after hearing about these guys, it doesn't seem as though it was that innovative. I mean, people were doing
Yes.
that before Amundsen.
That is a good point, except with the skis. Although Nansen was using the skis before Amundsen. I would agree. I don't know Amundsen's story that well when it comes to the South Pole, but skis had already been used, furs were being used. I will say the Scandinavians had a much more natural and sensible approach to Arctic exploring at the time. I mean, to be fair, they also had some of these skills, too. I don't think anyone was skiing in America in the 1880s. I might be wrong about that. But then you have someone like Nansen, who was, of course, being Nansen, a champion skier. He wasn't just a skier. He was like the champion. And he knew that skis gave you a lot of bang for your buck. You went farther without using as much energy. And many of the Norwegians had grown up skiing and knew that simple fact of Arctic exploring, that the skis worked very well. There was just another sort of interesting cultural difference that's picked up on a lot in the literature. The Scandinavian attitude about this Arctic venturing, they were really more comfortable. And you hear tales of them having fun. And the thing about Nansen came back from, there's these starvation is such a concern, and they're always sort of running out of food and missing the relief expeditions. That's what happened with Greely. Nansen, when he met that British expedition and had the handshake, was actually fatter than when he'd left. He'd been eating a lot of seal. They were very good at hunting. They just took a sort of calm approach to things, and Peary is, to me, like the polar opposite of that. Just completely willful, willing to suffer huge amounts, almost as though that is part of the challenge. Is how much suffering can you endure? And the British were also completely guilty of that mentality. You see that in Scott with the South Pole expedition. But the Brits were so slow to adapt these other techniques and so into just continuing suffering. They were man-hauling, while other people were discovering the use of sled dogs. They were still having people haul this cargo by choice. They were wearing their woolens much longer than the other explorers were wearing these tight woolens, which are not good for cold weather wear. So a lot of cultural mentalities come into play when you're talking about strategies and tactics. And it's not just a purely objective scientific calculation. Cultural personality plays a big role.
dreamsicle. If you had to pick one of these explorers to have dinner with,
Yeah.
just for fun, for the sheer entertainment value, who would that be?
Which of these explorers would I choose to have dinner with I guess for entertainment? Well, I would say James Gordon Bennett. If I had to pick one, of the explorers, I think it would be. I'm clearly a Nansen man. I think Nansen was basking his aura. He just had it all, I think Frederick Cook was always described as warm and friendly and genial. This is why so many people loved him. He was really a popular hero, a man of the people, but he was also said never to really laugh. He was a nice guy, as the reports, but he was also a humorless guy. And of course, as you can tell, Peary was also quite humorless too. Or maybe it's just a main dry humor. I don't know. That humor can be quite dry. But I think Peary is a fairly tough guy to warm up to. Although I have to say I respect his insane capacity for suffering and his not just the desire to win, but he was a realist about it.
Yes.
But probably not fun to have a drink with.
Thank you. Thank you for a terrific talk. I think everybody.
Thanks, Lawrence. Appreciate it. Thank you. I will be. Thanks, Alex and Luis. I'll be signing books out there, which are available for purchase too. Appreciate you coming out.
That was even better than the other.
Thank you.
I know they're really good. Comfortable you can work here.
Thank you. It's great to be introduced by you too. Someone who's done all these work on this. I want to do more myself.
Good.